Good afternoon. I hope everyone is filled, but not too filled. Well, we have some more great sections in this study to cover. I have gone around and passed out note cards, and if you didn't get one, I will leave these on the table back here, and you can grab one at break. And basically what this is for is if during the lessons that we have heard thus far, or the lessons that we're about to hear, if you have a question that you would like to ask Jeff at the last session of the day, then please write it down on the note card, and then in between, well, I guess we'll do a little bit of break from your last session before the Q&A. I will get the note cards if you just want to put them on one of the tables back there, or we'll have Ben go around and pick them up, and then we will ask the questions, and it just makes it a little bit more uniform instead of having passed the mic and that sort of thing. So as you're listening to the discussions, if you have a question, please feel free to fill out your card, and we'll ask those questions during the Q&A. Okay, also want to remind everybody that this afternoon, in between this session coming up and the next one, we're going to take another 15-minute break, and when we do that, we invite you to have cookies, brownies, all sorts of wonderful treats that our ladies have provided in the lobby classroom. So just want to remind everybody about that. Well, I'm going to hand the floor now to Brother Jeff to begin our discussion of the Ice Age.
Isn't this interesting stuff, learning about these things? Imagine if you were in high school and you got to learn this stuff at that age and get course credit for it. And even better, if you got to go to Arizona and see a lot of the cool sights firsthand while you're doing that. That is what I'm doing with my flooded book, by the way. So these flyers that I have back there, if you know any kids that are age 14 to 18, basically, that you think it'd be great if they got to go learn this stuff in Arizona and do science out there. We do laboratories, and we go to a bunch of the Grand Canyon and Meteor Crater, and they would climb a volcano while we're out there, all kinds of stuff. And if you think that'd be great for them and faith enriching to them, then be sure to look into that course. They can actually even get dual enrollment credit now. They can actually get college credit as well for going out there and learning about this stuff with me in Arizona. By the way, I've had over the years several adults saying, well, I want to go out there and I want to learn this stuff, but I don't want to have to do all the coursework. And so there's a different trip called the Flood Experience that I've got flyers for. It's basically the same thing, but without all the coursework, and it's not as intensive. It's more of a vacation for anybody and everybody on that. So that's available too. In fact, I'll be leaving in about a week to go out to Arizona to lead one of those trips. And there'll be another one in June. So the flood, a very different portrait maybe than the one that we oftentimes have in our mind based on the way we think about this in Bible classes and pictures that are drawn for that and so forth. This is no pleasure cruise for Noah and his family by any means. The implications of this are pretty bad about what occurs to the earth. Now, on the same day that the waters began to decrease, the ark comes to rest in the mountains of Ararat. And the waters continued to recede for another 4 months. And during that period of recession, we know that the retreating flood waters would have catastrophically eroded many of the Earth's canyons, though not all of those. Grand Canyon is thought to have been eroded later. After 9 months, on the first day of the 10th month, Noah could see the tops of various mountains. Another 40 days go by, he sends out a raven and a dove, waits another week, sends the dove out again. And after it returns, he waits another week and then sends the dove out, and finally the dove does not return. So he waits another month, removes the covering from the ark, sees that the surface of the earth is dry, and after another almost 2 months, the earth is finally completely dried, and they leave the ark. So the timeline as given in the text is based on the Jewish calendar, which reckons time based on a lunar year. So 354 days total in a year. So based on the text, about a year and 11 days pass. So we have to convert that to the solar calendar, and you find that from beginning to end, Noah and the other passengers leave the ark after exactly 1 solar year, 365 days. And Noah and his family exit the ark, and from those 8 people repopulate the entire earth. So genetically, we all have a portion of Noah and his wife in our blood, regardless of our ethnicity. But we don't know whether the sons of Shem, Ham, and Japheth married their own sisters or married somebody outside of their family. We don't know. And that would affect how much of our genes go back only to Noah. But the passengers leave from the ark, find a completely different earth from the one that they experienced before the flood. Peter says that world perished. And there's no doubt a lot more meaning than we typically ascribe to that passage. This chart gives the lifespans of the patriarchs as recorded in the genealogies there in Genesis 5, Genesis 11. And notice the approximate 900-year lifespan before the flood, with the exception of Enoch, remember, who's taken by God, and Lamech. And then notice the gradual drop in lifespans after the flood, an exponential decay there. The Genesis 11 genealogies, which pick up after the flood, don't use exactly the same wording as the Genesis 5 genealogies, but this seems to provide some evidence for the fact that apparently something is drastically different about the earth due to the flood. Probably an environmental change that affects everything. Apparently, size, health, life longevity is all affected by what happens in the flood, and you see lifespans decreasing in a proportional way to possibly what's going on the earth as it's gradually calming down after the flood. And as further evidence of the major change that apparently occurred, Genesis 9, verses 2 and 3 tells us that animals would begin to fear and dread humans, possibly indicating something different about the nature of animals too, perhaps in how they're responding to their environment. And then in verse 3, apparently linked with that statement about the animals, we have the first mention of God authorizing a carnivorous diet for humans, which you would think would certainly lead to the animals fearing humans. And now it's unclear as to whether could there have been humans already eating animals before this. Probably. The text doesn't say, but God at least authorizes it here. We know that some animals were already carnivorous by this point because we find in the flood layers evidence of carnivory. We find, for example, fossilized creatures with other animals fossilized in their stomach cavity. Okay, so there's carnivory going on, at least in the flood. Another example of how different the world was after the flood would be the Ice Age, or the Ice Surge, or Ice Advance, depending upon which creation scientist you talk to. We find a lot of evidence on the earth that a huge portion of it was once covered with ice in the strata after the flood. In fact, about 30% of the land, as opposed to what it is today, about 10%. And so we can observe glacier movement today and the effects of glacier movement. And from those observations, we infer that the glaciers of the north used to extend deep into the northern hemisphere. You find, for example, striations that are parallel. These are scratches on rocks that will extend over miles and miles of plains from the rocks and boulders that are in glaciers that are scratching the rocks under glaciers as the glaciers expand or contract. You'll find faceted rocks that are worn flat from these glaciers as they move. And you'll find what's called till and moraine piled up as these glaciers move. So you imagine these glaciers expanding and they start pushing rocks and dirt in front of them. And then when summer hits and the glaciers start to contract, they'll leave these piles of material. And some of the material within the glaciers, as the glaciers start melting, they'll get left. And so this is called till and moraine, and they will pile up from glacier movement. So secular geologists today believe that there were multiple ice ages over millions of years, as many as 50. But there are a lot of issues with the secular interpretation of the evidence for these ice ages. No single theory has been able to explain all the evidence from a secular perspective. Why were there all these animal extinctions, but they only happened after the supposed last ice age? We have 167 entire genera of the larger mammals that all disappear from the earth only after the supposed last ice age. Why do you have all of the disharmonious associations where you have warm area animals like hippos living with the cold area animals like woolly mammoths and reindeer? So in the secular ice age idea, you've got a long period of time where it's just cold. You shouldn't have this mixing of animals. They should be very separate. Why is there evidence of areas that are now desert that used to be very lush, wet? And of course, the biggest issue that uniformitarians have, the secular guys, is that there is no known mechanism that can initiate a single ice age, much less multiple ice ages. So how do you get one started? And there's problems with all of the models they've tried to develop to figure this out, how they can initiate one from their perspective. Well, this is a place where, once again, biblical creation has provided a great answer to these problems with regard to the ice age. In fact, an ice age would be predicted to follow the flood based on catastrophic plate tectonics. It would have been a necessary effect. The flood would have triggered an ice age. So the fact that the ice age happened is actually evidence of the flood. Okay, so modern creation science theorizes that there weren't multiple ice ages. There was a single ice age, and we call it more of an ice advance because an age makes it sound like this is, thousands or tens of thousands of years or something. But it's more of an ice advance. It's a gradual accumulation of ice that lasts maybe about 700 years with a peak at about the 500-year mark. So creation scientists would say that all of the evidence that secular meteorologists are using to argue for ice ages over millions of years instead fits into a single major ice advance that lasts for just a few hundred years. So what would be needed to start this ice age period? Well, you might be tempted to think, well, you need colder winters. Okay, maybe that would do it. Well, that actually would have the opposite effect, because with coldness comes dryness, less moisture, which gets at the root of why the secular models can't figure out how you get an ice age to begin. You need some strange conditions for this to happen. There's three basic ingredients that you need. You need cooler summers, more moisture, not less, and a persistence of these two types of factors. So all three of these would have been effects of the flood. So this is a chart that kind of summarizes the creationist thinking on this. So according to catastrophic plate tectonics, as we looked at in the last session, all that volcanic activity going on during the flood and after the flood is injecting large amounts of ash and aerosol into the atmosphere, which would have blocked a lot of the solar radiation, which would cool your summers. That would have caused less melting during the summertime. So the way it works is during the winter, the glaciers expand. In the summer, they contract. So now we're in a period where the expansion is less than the contraction is, so the glaciers are getting smaller. For the ice advance, you need the contraction to be smaller than the expansion. And so you need your summers to be cooler. You got to have less melting. And so the ice would have been advancing annually in this pattern in waves. And eventually that's going to cause more and more extinctions towards the peak of the ice advance when the animal habitats are finally being threatened because of how far the glaciers are moving now. The pre-flood environment is also thought to have been likely warmer, including the ocean. But during the flood, they're getting a lot hotter. The oceans are going to be a lot hotter, several degrees higher. And the result of that would be more evaporation of the seawater, which leads to more precipitation, more rain, more snow away from the equator, for example. And then the third ingredient is you need a persistence of that. You need cooler summers, more precipitation, and you need that to persist for long enough for the glaciers to expand. Well, this increased volcanic activity from catastrophic plate tectonics is continuing for several decades after the flood. So the oceans would have continued providing significantly elevated evaporation for centuries until the earth finally calms down enough and it starts moving towards an equilibrium state, at which time the ice would start to retreat. And towards the end of this primary melting period, catastrophic melting would have been predicted to occur, with huge amounts of water forming lakes, even in areas that are now deserts, explaining the evidence for wet deserts. And as these glaciers are melting and the lakes grow from that, the natural dams holding the water in these makeshift lakes would breach, causing the rapid formation of various canyons, which is a phenomenon acknowledged to occur even by the secular community when these ice age dams breach like this. So for example, they argue that the Lake Missoula flood was a flood from an ice age known to have occurred due to the failure of one of these natural dams, and it caused immense destruction, including a 50-mile long trench between 1 and 6 miles in width, with walls up to 900 feet high, carved out of solid rock. Geologists estimate that 10 cubic miles of basalt from the trench was eroded rapidly by catastrophic flooding from the Lake Missoula flood. Grand Canyon is argued by creation scientists to have been formed in this manner during the ice advance period as well. So the evidence suggests that the layers of Grand Canyon are deposited during the flood, and then the carving occurred rapidly during the ice age, and there's a lot more that could be said about that. So the creationist ice advance theory may or may not be true. It's a theory. The Bible doesn't weigh in on this at all. But it has great explanatory power, starting with the biblical text and thinking through the science of the implications of this. It would follow that an ice advance should happen. And so it explains a huge amount of evidence where uniformitarian models are failing to explain the evidence. It explains why you have a huge number of animal extinctions only once. Well, because there's only one ice advance. It explains the disharmonious association of the animals, because you've got milder winters, cooler summers. It keeps all the animals relatively mixed, and this is only a relatively short amount of time. The evidence for wet deserts is explained by glaciers, animal dispersions from, for example, Asia to America across the Bering Strait after the flood. That's explained because you've got more water in the form of ice and in clouds, allowing access across the strait. Plus ice bridges would have been formed in various places. The rapid formation of post-flood canyons is explained. The thickness of the ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica that we'll talk about tomorrow morning. And of course, the biggest plus is that we have a clear-cut trigger for how you initiate one of these. It's predicted by our model. Again, they don't have a good trigger. We would say we've got one. And if it happened, it would definitely trigger the ice age. Now, while all that's going on, which is interesting, we keep in mind humanity, where this fits in Bible history. Humanity is reproducing after the flood. And not much is explicitly stated about the period immediately after the flood. There's not really evidence of writing at all for some time. Genesis 10 and 11 gives genealogical information about those intervening centuries during what creation scientists theorize to be the ice advance period. So you keep in mind that Moses is writing in 1400s BC, and this is all happening hundreds of years before that, right? And so We see him writing about things that are going on. But the genealogical information there in Genesis 10 and 11 helps us to see which line from Noah repopulated which areas of the world, but not much is known beyond that. From Seth to Abram, you've got 10 generations, and there isn't any evidence of any gaps there either, just like in Genesis 5. Now, that said, while there's no evidence of gaps in the lineup, Moses' terminology in Genesis 11 is not the same as the terminology in Genesis 5. And when all the evidence is weighed, there's potentially room for a few hundred more years in the Genesis 11 genealogies, not from individuals that are missing, but it has to do with some other things. We got an article that nails that down, what I'm talking about. But keep this in mind. When you stand back and look at the question of time in the genealogies, keeping in mind that the main reason we would argue for a young earth on the order of thousands of years old is because of these genealogies. It's Genesis 5, Genesis 11 that nail down when creation happened. And then there's other passages here and there that weigh in on it. But the main reason we argue this is Genesis 5 and Genesis 11. So even if Genesis 11 allowed for millions of years worth of injected time into the time scale there, it still wouldn't cause the Bible to fit the evolutionary paradigm. Creationists need to understand that. If you understand paleontology, you will understand that it doesn't help you. And here's why. When you look at the actual fossil record as portrayed by evolution, guess where you see humans show up on the scene? The genus Homo, which is likely the human fossils, all the Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, and Homo heidelbergensis, and all Homo sapiens, all the human fossils show up at the very top. Roughly, they would say 2 million years ago, based on the evolutionary time scale. So the very end of evolution, right? They would argue billions of years ago is when life began. Humans we're Johnny-come-latelys on the scene. Genesis 5 and Genesis 11 genealogies are both genealogies of humans. So if you squeeze time in there, you're squeezing time up here. Where's all the time that you got to squeeze into the text? It's all before that. The only place to get that is before day 6 of Genesis 1. And yet you can't do that because Moses nails down for us using in the Hebrew. You got other passages like Mark 10:6 and Luke 11:50 through 51, where Jesus himself says humans have been around from the beginning of creation, not the end. Humans have been around from the beginning. It doesn't fit with the evolutionary timeline. So the bulk of the fossil record is prior to humans from an evolutionary perspective. You can't make the two fit together. It doesn't work. But from these genealogies, we at least get an idea, though, of when the flood happened. And it can be anywhere between roughly 2350 BC and a few centuries before that, based on the terminology there in Genesis 11. So moving forward, we have Babel. And this is probably at the time of Peleg, based on Genesis 10:25. And this could have been as early as 100 years after the flood, or possibly just a few decades later, according to the genealogies in Genesis 11. And so this would fall during the period of the ice advance, which might help explain humanity's reluctance to obey God and start spreading out beyond the Palestinian area, or why God chose to step in when he did to make sure that the spread happened before the conditions of the ice age prevented passage to remote areas. But regardless, while there may have been several human languages before the flood. You had 1,600 years of people populating the earth. All of those would have been wiped out in the flood, and you would have had only one left. So when they get off the ark, they're speaking the language that Noah's family spoke. By the time of Babel, this is only, again, roughly 100 years later, that's still the only language. And then the language divisions are supernaturally created by God, and the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth begin to spread out from Palestine. And notably, human fossils in archaeological artifacts of humans don't appear in flood or pre-flood rock layers. They were all apparently wiped out in the flood, possibly in a subduction zone. Human fossils and artifacts don't appear until after the flood. So archaeologists study these artifacts and divide what they call early human history into 3 ages. And you keep in mind, this isn't early human history. Early human history would be the pre-flood humans, but they're gone. So this is early post-flood human history is really what we're talking about, but it's divided into, you've heard of, I'm sure, the Stone Age, and then the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. And so the Stone Age would correlate to what we would say post-flood, pre-Abraham, and the Bronze Age would be roughly Abraham to David. And then you have the Iron Age, and it depends on where you are in the world that would be the Iron Age, but this would be David to roughly Cyrus, about 550 BC. And so we would correlate the Stone Age especially with the dispersion period after Babel and the Ice Age. So archaeologists looking at these artifacts that have been dug up in those early post-flood layers see evidence that humans are nomadic during this time. They're called hunter-gatherers. They're moving from place to place. And they believe they're doing that for thousands of years until we supposedly evolved to the point where we get intelligent enough to start settling and farming and making cities and so forth. And again, we would interpret this evidence totally different. First of all, they weren't nomadic for thousands of years, possibly just hundreds of years. But yes, we would agree from the evidence that humans were nomadic during that period, and it fits with the Bible, right? Because after Babel, they're spreading out and filling the earth as God told them to do. And so they're nomads. It had nothing to do with intelligence, like they weren't smart enough to be able to farm or make houses in cities. It's because they weren't allowed to do that. They weren't allowed to dig in yet until the earth had been populated. And so they're spreading out and filling the earth as God told them to do in Genesis 9:1. So keep in mind that many of the what are called Native Americans that the Europeans run into, for example, in the 1400s, which by the way, Native Americans it's really a misnomer, because if you think about it, everybody gets off the ark, and the descendants of Shem apparently get over to North America first. Yes, there's your Native Americans. The descendants of Japheth take longer. They're going northeast, right? So they're coming from Europe. So they get over to the other side of the continent, and they're really just other descendants of Noah. They're both reaching the continents, and then the Native Americans really are just there first. It's just the descendants of Shem. But when they're encountered by the descendants of Japheth, we find that the Native Americans are also still, interestingly, a lot of them are nomadic. They're not even writing yet, a lot of them, okay? And this isn't because of a lack of intelligence, which is, again, how the modern secular guys are interpreting the Stone Age people as less intelligent whenever they have the same traits that the Native Americans did when the Europeans encountered them in the 1400s. It had nothing to do with intelligence. They just weren't inclined to put down roots in one place. They're not staying put for very long. And so you don't expect them to have cities and houses and so forth. And so that is, sure enough, what we see in those Stone Age layers. And you find evidence, for example, that they're staying in tents or caves. And sure enough, cavemen are associated with the Paleolithic period of the Stone Age. And they're always depicted from an evolutionary perspective, as though they're a bunch of, dum-dums with, carrying around clubs, grunting and stuff, which we have a lot of that today, actually. But this has nothing to do with intelligence. These people are staying in caves because, let me tell you, caves make a pretty convenient shelter if you're just needing temporary place to stay. So people are finding shelter in caves and during that time period. But after a few hundred years, they're finally spread out. They begin to get settled. Different archaeological artifacts begin surfacing as more products are being developed by humans that would be useful in a farming culture and in a culture that is putting its roots down, what archaeologists call the Bronze Age. And it's during that time that we start finding evidence of writing. Could humans have been writing before that, during the dispersion? Maybe. We haven't found evidence of that yet. But they were certainly intellectually capable of it, although I have seen some articles by secular guys recently where they're now realizing that the drawings that were being done by the Stone Age people may have actually been a kind of writing. So they're starting to even back off of that idea too. But they're drawing pictures during this time period. Again, I don't think because of intelligence, but maybe they just hadn't developed written languages yet. Keep in mind that whenever God miraculously makes new languages at Babel, they would have possibly had to develop the written forms of those languages. Nothing is said in the text about that. You would expect that they would no longer be able to use the same written language, otherwise it would defeat the purpose of God changing their verbal languages. So they probably had to develop their own written languages after that. So it's interesting that in the caves, there are basic drawings made that make people think, oh, these are unintelligent or something, people. But it could be that they're, like one of the secular papers I was reading recently, they were hypothesizing that it could be that some of these drawings were highlighting to other people that were going to be coming through later where the water sources were. Okay, so if you're going to do that and the next people that are coming through might not know your language because of Babel, what are you going to do? Well, you have to draw pictures instead because they're not going to know your language. So they would draw pictures that kind of would highlight where water sources were and so forth so that the next people that are coming through the hotel, so to speak, would be able to find these sources. So I find that interesting. One final interesting point about the Ice Age. When did Job live? The Bible doesn't come out and tell us, and there's a lot of debate about that, but there are several interesting puzzle pieces in the book that really, I think, nail this down. Several clues that help us to surmise that he's living during this period, at least on the tail end of it. For example, a flood is mentioned by Eliphaz, and while floods happen a lot, I only know of one that is directly mentioned as being a punishment for wiping out wicked men. And Eliphaz mentions this. So this would suggest a post-flood date. Job 38:16, God highlights, remember, the recesses of the deep, the ocean, which seems to be referring to the deep sea trenches, which don't form until the flood, right, according to creation geology. So that would be post-flood. Also, the text doesn't specifically reveal Job's age when he died. Job 42:16 tells us he lived 140 years after the events described in the book, but it doesn't tell you how old he was when they started. But he's old enough to have 10 apparently grown children, suggesting that he may have been 50, 60 years or higher, which would mean he was at least 200 years old when he died. So that age was described as being old and full of days in chapter 42, verse 17, which wouldn't have described Job if he lived prior to the flood, because people are living to be over 900 years old. So he's a young whippersnapper from their perspective, right? So when you consider that Terah, Abraham's father, lived to be 205, Abraham lived to be 175, Isaac was 180, Jacob was 147, we see that Job's age fits nicely around the time of Abram, or possibly just before. Several names are mentioned in Job, which were likely named after individuals mentioned in the post-flood period in Genesis 10 through 36, and that argues for Job living post-flood, and those names argue for his living during the pre-Mosaic period, the patriarchal age. Sources outside of the Bible also verify some of those names as being from the second millennium BC, around the time of Abraham. Also, no mention is made of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain, though it surely would have been known to the inhabitants of Uz, while again, the flood is mentioned in the book, as would be expected. And so this suggests pre-Sodom and Gomorrah, so pre-Genesis 18. Also arguing for a pre-Mosaic patriarchal time, Job is described as offering sacrifices for his family, remember? And this is a patriarchal custom that occurred throughout the time before Moses. And his wealth is measured not in money, but in livestock and possessions. This seems to be pre-money in the way you mark down your wealth. Also, God talks directly to Job in chapters 38 through 42, as he did to the patriarchs before Moses. Also, no mention is made of anything pertaining to the law of Moses or the events that are affecting the Israelites in Egypt or Canaan, even though Uz, where Job lived, is thought to be in that neck of the woods, which would suggest that Job lived pre-Moses. And in fact, his daughters are given an inheritance at the end of the book, which was not customary during the Mosaic period. Also, a kind of money is mentioned, which dates back to the pre-Mosaic patriarchal period as well. The style of the book matches other writings that date to the second millennium BC. And so these and other factors suggest that the events of Job take place possibly at the time of Abraham or before, which would be the tail end of the Ice Age. Now, it is interesting to note that cities are mentioned as existing in the book, chapter 15, verse 28. And interestingly, there are no known cities in Ice Age layers, which are the Pleistocene layers. So cities don't show up until the higher rock layers of the Holocene, which is where Abraham is thought to have lived, because cities are clearly in existence during his time. You've got, for example, the 5 cities of the plains that are mentioned. But I could only find one reference to cities in the book of Job, which isn't really typical of other Bible books that are relating historical accounts. Instead of cities, lands are described, or people who eventually had cities or lands named after them. So Job may have lived on the tail end of the Ice Age and Babel dispersion, transitioning into the time period when cities then start to get planted with his life, perhaps even overlapping with that of Abraham. Interestingly, snow and ice are also mentioned several times in the book, even though snow would have likely been even rarer in Uz than it is today in Florida, it being so close to the equator. So why would snow and ice have been such a hot topic in Job? So again, it would fit with Job having lived around the time of the Ice Age. So assuming so, the book of Job would tell us much about the mindset of mankind during that time period, as well as what's going on in the animal kingdom at that time, including the mention of Behemoth, which most closely matches the description of a sauropod dinosaur, and Leviathan, which is possibly a type of large marine reptile like a mosasaur or plesiosaur. All right, so as we wrap up looking at the creation model before we start to try to defend this in our next session, isn't it amazing what we can learn about this event from science? You know, how much science adds to this and draws out some of the details. It's fun, but it's also alarming because remember, God didn't want us to forget the flood, right? He likely executed on the low end at least 215 million people by drowning, and that would have been the easy way to go. In some cases, crushing, burning, mutilation, melting, poisoning, dismemberment, or even disintegration. Crushed by meteorites, covered in burned or melted by lava, flattened or disintegrated from intense seismic activity, eroded to particles by the power of tsunamis and the intense ultrasonic cavitation going on, swallowed by the earth, stampeded or eaten by animals, poisoned by toxic fumes and water, burned by sulfuric acid. And yet the flood tells us things about God. It tells us his feelings about sin. It tells us not just that, but it tells us about his concern for his people, those who are really striving to live righteous lives. Think about that. It would not have been easy to survive even if you were on the ark, the kind of things going on. God is just as passionate about preserving his people as he is about punishing the wicked. Jesus called the attention of his audience back to the flood. In Matthew 24, he says, "As the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying, giving in marriage," right? No worries. "Until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away." Isn't that such an understatement? So also will the coming of the Son of Man be, right? Is it important to study the works of the Lord like the flood? I would say it's crucial that humanity not forget the significance of the flood, and yet it has, right? Isn't it amazing that that symbol of the rainbow has become a symbol of the very kind of behavior that no doubt led to the flood in the first place? I mean, the flood's been forgotten. God did not want this event forgotten because it is a physical depiction of what God feels about sin and what it means when he says he's holy. When we go out and look at a high mountain and we think, oh, that's pretty, God made the mountains. Well, you shouldn't forget why that mountain exists. Like, you now know where it came from, and it was violent the way that formed. The flood is a reminder about God's holiness and the necessity of human repentance if we want to please him. It's a reminder that judgment can always be just around the corner when we least expect it, which is Jesus' point here in Matthew 24. And that's Peter's point in 2 Peter 3, when he warns us not to forget the flood and God's coming judgment. But again, doom and gloom isn't the whole message of the flood. The Bible's loaded with antitypes, ideas that are represented by symbols. And many people will highlight, for example, John 10, 1 through 9, when they're thinking about the ark and the flood. Jesus uses the symbolism or the illustration, John 10, 6, of Jesus being like a door into the safety of the sheepfold. And in verse 9, he says, I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved. And so the door of the ark is often equated with Jesus. Well, how does one go through the door to be saved? And that's an important question. And while the Bible does not make this specific correlation about Jesus being like the door of the ark, Scripture does come out and explicitly use the flood as an antitype to answer that question. Water baptism in the New Testament is used as the antitype, the symbol for how Noah was saved through water. The divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 souls, were saved through water. There's also an antitype which now saves us, baptism. Not the removal of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I highly recommend visiting the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter if you haven't done that. I mean, they're state of the art. It's great stuff. But ironically, the Ark Encounter conspicuously leaves this passage out. It doesn't have this verse anywhere, even though this is the explicit antitype Scripture uses. Instead, they just use the John 10, Jesus is the door idea, and leave out the actual antitype that the Bible, God himself, chose to put in there. They don't want to push the idea of baptism saving you, right? That's the issue. Another antitype, Hebrews 11:7, says that by faith Noah prepared an ark for the saving of his household. So the ark was the receptacle for the saved. And in Ephesians 5:23, Paul highlights that those whom Christ will save in the end are those who are in the receptacle of the saved, the body of Christ, his church, right? He is the Savior of the body, which is made clear there to be the church. And so in the same way that the church is the body of Christ, that is the receptacle of the people who will be saved in the end, the ark was the church in Noah's day. So those who entered the one ark that Noah built were the saved individuals that were then saved through water, like the church is today. So the one church that Christ built can no more be removed from the biblical portrait of salvation than the ark can be removed from the Bible's portrait of salvation in Noah's day. They're both essential receptacles. The ark serves as an antitype of the church in Noah's day, roughly 2,400 years before the church came into existence. So the flood isn't just a reminder of the wrath of God. The wrath of God is poured out in the flood, but it's easy to forget what he was doing for Noah and his family while his wrath was being poured out. The flood is a reminder that those who, like Noah, obey God can be saved through water and receive the benefit of God's grace, which is Peter's emphasis in 1 Peter 3. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, Genesis 6:8. And so one of the beautiful things we learn about the flood is that the same passion that God feels towards implementing justice on the ungodly, he has the same passion towards saving those who are diligently seeking him. He's a shield to the faithful, Psalm 5:12. The problem is there's rarely very many of them. Most people are like, I don't really like, I don't want to have to get on that ark. It's going to be smelly, got a bunch of hypocritical people on there. That's what people, people don't like what God says to do, but he doesn't make it real complicated. I don't like that I've got to do something, Baptism is something I have to do. I don't want to have to, whatever the excuse is. But the Bible's always been clear. You just need to believe what God says and choose to obey it. Don't give me your excuses, just do as you're told. That's always been what God's message is. Trust and obey, for there's no other way. All right, we will take a 15-minute break then, and then we'll have another session before our Q&A. Anything else you want to report?
Well, we're running a little bit ahead of time, so we'll start the next session at, let's say 2:20.
2:20.